The sun hammered down on the red earth of Mesa Ridge like a blacksmith striking an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. It was the summer of 1885, and the heat did not just sit in the air, it had weight. It pressed against the wooden slats of the storefronts, curled the edges of the wanted posters tacked to the sheriff's office, and boiled the blood of every man and beast unfortunate enough to be caught in the open. Mesa Ridge was a scar on the edge of the Navajo territory, a town built on the promise of the expanding railroad and the blood of those who had been pushed aside to make way for it. The air smelled of dry sage, horse manure, and the metallic tang of imminent violence. Here, the law was a fluid concept, usually dictated by the man with the deepest pockets or the quickest draw. A dry wind kicked up a devil of red dust, swirling it down the main street. Through the haze, a rider appeared. The horse was a massive, uglied-up gray gelding, an animal that looked half wild and entirely mean. It threw its head, chomping at the bit, its hooves striking the hard-packed earth with a heavy, rhythmic thud. The rider sat the saddle with the easy, loose-limbed grace of someone who had spent more hours on horseback than on their own 2 feet. She wore a battered Stetson pulled low, the brim frayed and stained with sweat. Her duster coat was the color of dried tobacco, hiding the curves that might have betrayed her softness, though there was very little softness left in Caroline Hart. Carrie, as she had called herself since the night the sky turned orange with fire, kept her eyes moving. They were hazel eyes, sharp and restless, scanning the shadows of the boardwalks and the rooftops. She knew what hung on the wall of the general store. She had seen her own face staring back at her from a piece of parchment in the last 3 towns. Wanted dead or alive, Caroline Hart, $500. $500 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a small farm, or enough whiskey to drown a man's conscience for a decade. To the people of Mesa Ridge, she was not a woman. She was a lottery ticket. She pulled the gray to a halt in front of the Lucky Horseshoe Saloon. The horse pinned his ears back and snapped his teeth at the rail, but Carrie swung down before the beast could throw a fit. She tied the reins loosely. She never tied a hard knot, not when a quick exit was usually the difference between breathing and hanging, and patted the horse's sweaty neck. "Easy, Ghost," she murmured, her voice raspy from the dust. "Don't kick anyone unless they deserve it." She stepped onto the boardwalk, her spurs jingling with a sound that usually announced a gunfighter. When she pushed through the swinging bat-wing doors of the saloon, the noise inside the tinny clatter of a piano, the roar of laughter, the clinking of glass died down to a low, wary murmur. Carrie Hart walked into the room like a storm front. She ignored the eyes that latched onto her. She could feel them crawling over her skin, heavy with judgment and lust. To them, she was the untamable girl, the wild hellcat who had supposedly seduced and murdered the son of Colton Briggs, the richest rancher in the territory. The rumors said she was a whore who had turned on a client, a cold-blooded killer who laughed when she pulled the trigger. The truth was a heavy stone in her gut, but she did not carry it for show. She walked to the bar, her boots thudding against the sawdust-strewn floor. The bartender, a balding man with a nervous tick in his left eye, wiped a rag across the polished wood. He stopped when she leaned against the counter. "Whiskey," she said. "Leave the bottle." He hesitated, glancing over her shoulder toward a table in the back where 3 of Sheriff Hale's deputies were playing poker. "We don't usually serve unaccompanied women in here, Miss." Carrie looked up, pushing the brim of her hat back just enough to reveal the grime on her face and the cold fire in her eyes. "I have money, and I have a thirst. Pour the drink, or I will go behind there and pour it myself." She slapped a silver dollar onto the wood. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the quiet room. The bartender swallowed hard, grabbed a bottle of rot-gut rye and a glass, and slid them toward her. As she poured the amber liquid, Carrie watched the room through the mirror behind the bar. It was an old trick, one her father had taught her before the world went dark. "Never look at the man, Carrie. Look at his reflection. It tells you what his hands are doing." That was when she saw him. He was sitting at a small table in the darkest corner of the room, away from the piano and the loud-mouthed cowboys. He was a shadow made flesh. Kalen Yazzie. She did not know his name then, but she knew what he was. A Navajo warrior. He wore the clothes of a white man, a canvas shirt and dark trousers, but he wore them with a discomfort that suggested they were a costume. Around his neck was a leather cord strung with turquoise, and his hair, black as a raven's wing, was tied back severely. He was not drinking. He was sitting with a stillness that was unnatural, his hands resting flat on the table. He was looking at her, not with the hungry leering of the cowboys, but with a detached, clinical assessment. It was the way a wolf looked at a deer, calculating the distance and the wind. Kalen was a scout. Carrie had seen his kind before, men who walked the razor's edge between the army forts and the reservations. The white men didn't trust them, calling them savages, and their own people often spat on them for taking the army's coin. He was alone in a room full of men who would happily shoot him if the law allowed it. Yet, no one sat near him. There was a perimeter of empty space around his table, a silent testament to the danger he radiated. Carrie looked away, lifting the glass to her lips. The whiskey burned going down, a welcome fire that fought the chill of memory. "Well now, look what the wind blew in," a voice drawled from her right. Carrie did not turn. She recognized the voice. It belonged to a man named Silas, a drifting cowhand who thought he was charming because he had all his teeth. "Go away, Silas," she said into her glass. "That ain't no way to talk to an old friend," Silas said, stepping closer. The smell of stale beer and unwashed skin rolled off him. He reached out, his hand closing over her upper arm. "I heard about the price on your head. Carrie, $500. That makes you a mighty expensive piece of skirt." The moment his fingers tightened on her sleeve, Carrie moved. It was not a chaotic struggle. It was a single, fluid motion, honed by 3 years of living on the run. She spun, her left hand clamping onto his wrist, twisting it backward against the joint, while her right hand drew the Colt Peacemaker from her hip. Before Silas could blink, the cold steel of the barrel was jammed under his chin, forcing his head back. "I said," Carrie whispered, her voice low and deadly. "Go away." The saloon went deathly silent. The piano player stopped mid-chord. Silas's eyes went wide, the color draining from his sunburned face. "I was just joking, Carrie, just having a bit of fun." "I don't like your fun," she said. She shoved him backward. He stumbled over his own boots and fell into a table, sending cards and chips flying. Carrie holstered the gun with a smooth, practiced motion, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She hated being touched. The sensation of a man's hand on her arm brought back flashes of that night in the barn, the smell of smoke, the tearing of fabric, the heavy, suffocating weight of Colton Briggs' son. She turned back to her drink, her hands trembling slightly. She willed them to be still. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back again, but the mood had shifted. The lust was gone, replaced by fear and a calculating greed. From the corner, the Navajo scout watched. Kalen had not moved during the altercation. He had not reached for the knife at his belt or the Winchester leaning against the wall. He had simply watched. But now, his dark eyes narrowed slightly. He had seen the tremor in her hand. He saw what the others missed. The untamable girl was not made of iron. She was made of raw nerves and desperation. Kalen took a slow sip of the water in front of him. He had a job to do. The Army major at Fort Wingate had paid him to find the girl and hold her until the marshal arrived. But looking at her now, a small, fierce thing standing alone against a room full of wolves, he felt a strange ripple of unease. He knew about being hunted. The Navajo, the Dine, had been hunted across these deserts for 20 years. They had been marched to the Bosque Redondo, starved and broken. Kalen had survived the long walk as a boy. He knew the look of someone who had nowhere left to run. The saloon doors swung open again, and the humidity of the day seemed to rush in. followed by Sheriff Hale. Hale was a thick-set man with a face like a slab of ham and a tin star pinned to his chest that shone brighter than his reputation. He was Colton Briggs's dog, bought and paid for. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Carrie. "Afternoon, Miss Hart," Hale said, hooking his thumbs into his gun belt. "You have got a lot of nerve showing your face in Mesa Ridge." Carrie turned slowly, keeping her elbows on the bar. "It is a free country, Sheriff. Last I checked." "Not for horse thieves and murderers," Hale said. He walked further into the room, his spurs clinking. Two deputies stood up from the back table, their hands hovering near their guns. "I didn't steal the horse," Carrie said, her voice steady. "And I didn't murder that boy. He killed himself trying to force me." "That ain't the story Colton Briggs tells," Hale sneered. "And since Mr. Briggs owns the land you're standing on, and the water you drink, his story is the only one that matters." Carrie felt the trap closing. She had come to town for supplies, bullets, and dried beef, thinking she could slip in and out while the town slept the siesta. She had miscalculated. The greed of the town was more awake than she thought. "I am just passing through. Hale," she said. "I will finish my drink and be gone." "I don't think so," Hale said. He signaled to his deputies. "Mr. Briggs has a special interest in seeing you hang. He wants a public trial, a show for the good people of the county." Carrie's hand drifted toward her gun, but she knew the odds. 3 deputies, the sheriff, and a room full of civilians who would shoot her for the reward money. "You take me in," Carrie warned, "and I will take 2 of you with me." Hale laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "You are a feisty one, I will give you that, but you are tired, girl. I can see it in your shoulders. You have been running for 6 months. How long can you keep it up?" She was tired. God, she was so tired. She remembered the ranch before the fire, the green pastures, the sound of her father reading the Bible in the evenings. She remembered the lace dress her aunt had sent her from St. Louis. Put it on. Caroline. Her father had said, "Be a lady for once." She had hated that dress. It felt like a cage. But now, looking at the dust-caked reflection in the mirror, she wondered if the cage of lace was worse than the cage of fear she lived in now. She had burned the dress the night she buried her father. She had cut her hair with a skinning knife and sworn that no man would ever own her again. But standing here, surrounded by Hale's men, she felt the walls shrinking. "I am not going to jail," Carrie said. "Then you will die right here," Hale said, his hand dropping to his pistol. Suddenly, a chair scraped against the wooden floor. The sound was deliberately loud, cutting through the tension. Every head turned toward the dark corner. Kalen Yazzie stood up. He unfolded his tall frame slowly, rising like smoke from a fire. He was taller than any man in the room, broad-shouldered and lean. He stepped out of the shadows, the silver on his belt catching the light. "Sheriff," Kalen said. His voice was deep, resonating with a calmness that was more terrifying than a shout. He spoke English with a precise, slightly formal cadence. Hale frowned, his eyes darting to the Navajo. "This ain't your business. Indian, sit down." Kalen walked forward, his movements silent. He stopped 10 feet from the bar, creating a triangle between himself, Carrie, and the sheriff. He did not look at Carrie. He kept his eyes on Hale. "The girl is federal business," Kalen said. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a travel warrant, signed by a major at the fort. It authorized Kalen to secure assets for the army. It was vague, meant for seizing horses or grain. But Hale didn't know that. "I am taking her into custody," Kalen lied smoothly. "She is to be transported to Fort Wingate for questioning regarding the sale of whiskey to the Apache." Carrie stared at him. Whiskey to the Apache. It was an absurd lie. She had never sold a drop of liquor in her life, but she saw the hesitation in Hale's eyes. "She killed Colton Briggs's son," Hale argued, though his hand wavered over his gun. That is a local crime. Army jurisdiction overrides local warrants when treason is suspected, Kalen said. He took another step forward. Unless you want to explain to the colonel why you interfered with a military scout. The room held its breath. This was the conflict of the West in a microcosm, the brute force of local money against the looming, bureaucratic power of the federal government. Hale hated the army. They meddled, but he feared them. And he hated the Navajo standing before him. He hated the way Kalen looked at him without blinking, without fear. I don't take orders from a savage, Hale spat. Then take orders from the paper, Kalen said, tossing the document onto a nearby table. Hale didn't pick it up. He knew he was being maneuvered, but he couldn't figure out the angle. Why would a Navajo scout care about a white girl? Carrie watched Kalen, her mind racing. Was this a rescue, or was she just trading one executioner for another? The army treated prisoners worse than dogs. If he took her to the fort, she would rot in a cell. But then Kalen glanced at her. For a fraction of a second. His eyes locked with hers. There was a message there, hidden behind the obsidian darkness of his irises. Play along. He is right, Carrie said, thinking fast. She spat on the floor near Hale's boot. I sold the whiskey. Barrels of it. Hale looked between them, his face turning a mottled purple. He knew they were lying, but he also knew that Elias Pike, the bounty hunter, was due in town by sundown. If the Indian took the girl, Pike could track them, let the Navajo do the work of dragging her out of town. It saved Hale a bullet. Fine, Hale growled. Now you take her. But if she doesn't make it to the fort, if she ends up loose again, I will hunt you down. Boy, I will scalp you myself. Kalen's expression did not change. She is my prisoner. He turned to Carrie. He did not ask her to come. He did not offer a hand. He simply gestured toward the door with his chin. Let's go, he said. Carrie hesitated. Every instinct in her screamed to run, to shoot her way out the back. But 3 deputies blocked the rear exit. The front door was her only path, and the Navajo was the key to that door. She holstered her gun. Though she kept her hand resting on the grip, she walked past Kalen, close enough to smell him. He smelled of sagebrush, leather, and rain. He did not smell like the stale alcohol of the saloon. As they stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the street, the heat hit them again. The town was watching. People had gathered on the porches, whispering. They saw the untamable girl, the killer, walking side by side with the dark, silent warrior. Kalen stopped by his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa tied next to her gray. He looked at her, and for the first time, he spoke to her directly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Do not try to run, he said. Not yet. I don't take orders from you, Carrie hissed, her hand tightening on her reins. Why did you help me? I didn't help you, Kalen said, mounting his horse in one swift motion. He looked down at her, his face unreadable against the glare of the sun. I just claimed you before they could kill you. Claimed me, Carrie repeated, the word tasting like ash. I belong to no one. For now, Kalen said, turning his horse toward the open desert. You belong to the road, and the road belongs to me. He kicked his horse into a trot, not waiting to see if she followed. Carrie stood there for a heartbeat, the dust swirling around her boots. She looked back at the saloon, where Sheriff Hale was undoubtedly pouring a drink and planning her funeral. Then she looked at the vast, red horizon where the Navajo rode. She spat into the dirt. Damn it all! She swung onto the gray horse and kicked him forward. She wasn't following Kalen Yazzie because she trusted him. She was following him because the desert was the only place big enough to hide her sins. But as they rode out of Mesa Ridge, leaving the town and its laws behind, Carrie felt a new kind of danger. It wasn't the cold steel of a gun or the roughness of a rope. It was the silence of the man riding 10 paces ahead of her. A man who had looked at the fire in her eyes and hadn't blinked. The wind picked up. howling through the canyons, carrying the promise of a storm. The hunt had begun. The hoofbeats of the gray gelding had barely found their rhythm on the hard-packed dirt of the main street when the world seemed to contract. The illusion of escape, which had tasted so sweet and sharp in the back of Caroline Hart's throat, shattered like a dropped whiskey bottle. They had not made it past the livery stable at the edge of town. From the southern road, a cloud of dust heralded the arrival of a group of riders moving with a speed that suggested purpose. At the lead was a man whose reputation arrived in towns days before he did. Elias Pike. He was a man built of gristle and malice, wearing a long coat that had seen more rain and blood than any garment should. Carrie pulled hard on the reins, the gray rearing slightly. Kalen, riding the Appaloosa a few paces ahead, halted. His posture stiffened, not with fear, but with the alert tension of a predator realizing another predator had entered the clearing. Sheriff Hale, emboldened by the sight of the reinforcements, shouted from the boardwalk behind them, "Block them! Don't let that witch leave my town." It happened fast, the way violence always did in the heat and explosion of movement after a long stillness. Two of Hale's deputies rushed from the alleyway of the livery, leveling shotguns at Kalen. Pike's men, dusty and road-weary but sharp-eyed, fanned out across the street, cutting off the exit to the desert. Carrie reached for the Colt at her hip, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the grip. But a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder from behind. She had been so focused on the road ahead she had not heard the third deputy come up on her blind side. "Don't do it, girl," a voice growled in her ear. "Give me a reason to blow a hole in you, please." She was yanked from the saddle. The ground rushed up to meet her, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. Before she could scramble to her knees, a boot pressed into the small of her back, pinning her to the red dirt. The humiliation was instant and burning, hotter than the sun. "Well, well," Elias Pike said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. He walked his horse closer, looking down at her with the eyes that were dead and flat. "If it isn't the wild heart of Mesa Ridge, you are smaller than the stories say." Sheriff Hale waddled up, breathless and red-faced, triumph oozing from his pores. The fear he had shown in the saloon was gone, replaced by the bluster of a bully who had found his stick. "Get her up," Hale ordered. "Tie her hands, tight. I want everyone to see this." Rough hands hauled Carrie to her feet. She spat a mouthful of dust and blood at the deputy holding her left arm. He backhanded her, a sharp crack that echoed against the storefronts. But she didn't cry out. She just glared, her hazel eyes burning with a hatred so pure it could have ignited the dry timber of the boardwalk. "You are a brave man when you have 5 guns backing you up. Hale," she rasped. "And you are a dead woman walking," Hale retorted. He turned to the gathering crowd. The townsfolk were spilling out of the stores and the saloon, drawn by the commotion. It was the Theater of the West, and they were the hungry audience. "This woman is a killer, a whore who murdered Colton Briggs's boy. We don't need a judge to tell us what to do with trash like this." "Hang her!" a voice shouted from the back. "String her up," another joined in. Carrie looked around, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw faces she recognized: the blacksmith, the woman who sold eggs, the piano player, people she had traded with, people she had nodded to. Now, they looked at her with a collective madness, the mob mentality stripping away their humanity. Elias Pike swung down from his horse. He was a giant of a man, carrying a coil of rope over his shoulder as casually as a woman might carry a parasol. He approached Carrie, invading her space, smelling of old sweat and tobacco. "Colton Briggs sent a wire," Pike said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "He wants a public trial, but mostly, he wants a show. He wants every rancher and drifter to see what happens when you cross the Briggs family." He grabbed Carrie's wrists, twisting them behind her back with unnecessary force. She gritted her teeth, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a whimper. He looped the rough hemp around her wrists, pulling the knot tight enough to burn. "You are hurting her," A deep voice cut through the jeers. It was not a shout, but it carried the weight of a stone dropping into a deep well. Kalen Yazzie had not dismounted. He sat on his Appaloosa, surrounded by 2 deputies with shotguns, yet he looked as though he were the one in command. He had watched the scene unfold with that unnerving stillness, but now he turned his gaze to Pike. Pike looked up, squinting at the Navajo. "And who might you be? Boy, you look like you are far from the reservation." "I am the one holding the warrant," Kalen said. "I don't see no warrant," Pike sneered. "I see an Indian on a horse that looks too good for him." Kalen ignored the insult. He reached into his shirt pocket again, producing the folded paper he had shown Hale in the saloon. "Federal authority. Major James Sterling, 3rd Cavalry. This woman is remanded to my custody for transport to Fort Wingate." Hale stepped forward, waving his hands. "We went over this. Savage Pike is here now. State bounty overrides your piece of paper. Besides, Briggs wants her here." "The Army does not care what Mr. Briggs wants," Kalen said calmly. "And the Army does not take kindly to civilians interfering with military assets." "Assets?" Pike laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "She is meat, boy. $500 worth of meat." The tension in the street stretched thin. The deputies looked between Hale, Pike, and the stoic Navajo. They knew that shooting a federal scout, even an Indian one, could bring the cavalry down on the town like a hammer. But they also knew who paid their wages. Just then, a young man on a sweating bay horse pushed through the crowd. It was one of Colton Briggs' ranch hands, a boy no older than 20 named Toby. "Sheriff," Toby called out. "Mister, Briggs says if the Army wants her, let them have her for now." The crowd murmured in confusion. Hale looked like he had swallowed a toad. "What, why?" "He says he don't want a war with the fort," Toby shouted, looking nervous. "He says, let the savages take her. If she dies on the way, fine. If she makes it to the fort, he will send his lawyers to fetch her back for the hanging. He says—" The boy paused, looking at Carrie with a mixture of pity and disgust. "He says waiting will make the fruit sweeter." It was a reprieve, but a sickening one. Carrie felt the bile rise in her throat. Pike spat on the ground, clearly unhappy about losing his immediate payday. But he was a professional. He knew better than to fight a war on 2 fronts, the Army and the local tycoon. "Fine," Pike grunted. He shoved Carrie forward, nearly knocking her into the dirt. "Take her then, but you better watch your back. Scout, deserts are big places. People get lost." Kalen did not look at Pike. He urged his horse forward, parting the crowd like a ship cutting through water. He stopped beside Carrie. He did not get down to help her. He looked down at her from his saddle, his face a mask of indifference. To the crowd, he looked like a master collecting a wayward servant. "Get on the horse," Kalen commanded. Carrie struggled. Her hands were tied behind her back, her balance compromised. She looked up at him, her eyes flashing with fury. "Cut the ropes." "No," Kalen said. "I can't ride like this," she snapped. "Then you will walk," he replied coldly. "And it is a long walk to Wingate." The crowd laughed. The sound was ugly, mocking. Kalen leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear, though his tone remained harsh for the benefit of the onlookers. "Stop fighting! Get on the horse, or they will kill you right here!" Carrie swallowed her pride. It tasted like dust. She awkwardly maneuvered to her gray horse, using the stirrup to hop and twist, pulling herself into the saddle with nothing but leg strength and sheer will. It was an impressive display of horsemanship, and for a second, the laughter died down. Kalen looked at the crowd, then at Hale and Pike. His gaze swept over them, cold and possessive. "She is mine to take," Kalen announced. His voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "My prisoner, my burden." The words hung in the hot air. "She is mine." To the men of Mesa Ridge, it sounded like a claim of ownership, a man taking possession of a woman. They saw the dark intent in his eyes and projected their own twisted desires onto him. They assumed he meant to use her before he turned her in. It was a language they understood power and possession. Carrie felt a flush of heat rise up her neck, not from the sun, but from the shame of being spoken of like cattle. Mine. The word echoed in her head. She looked at Kalen's broad back, hating him, but she also saw the hands of the deputies drifting away from their triggers. His words, vile as they were to her ears, had bought her life. "Move out," Kalen ordered. He turned his horse and began to ride south, toward the open desert. Carrie followed, her gray horse falling into step behind his Appaloosa. She kept her head high, refusing to look at the faces of the townspeople. She would not give them her tears. They rode in silence until the town of Mesa Ridge was nothing but a smudge of smoke and dust on the horizon. The sounds of the saloon and the jeering crowd faded, replaced by the hollow whistle of the wind through the sagebrush. Only when they were truly alone, surrounded by the vast, red emptiness of the territory, did Kalen slow his horse. He signaled for her to stop. He dismounted and walked over to her. Without a word, he drew a knife from his belt. Carrie flinched, her muscles locking up. She thought of the threats, the untamable girl meeting a savage end. But Kalen simply walked behind her and sliced the rope binding her wrists. Her hands fell free. She brought them forward, rubbing the raw red marks on her skin. The circulation returned with a painful prickling sensation. She looked down at him from her saddle. "Why?" she asked, her voice rough. Kalen sheathed the knife. He looked up at her, squinting against the sun. "Because you cannot shoot if your hands are tied." Carrie blinked. "Shoot, I thought I was your prisoner." "You are," Kalen said. He walked back to his horse and mounted up. "But we are being followed." Carrie twisted in her saddle. Looking back the way they came, the horizon was empty. "I don't see anyone." "Pike," Kalen said. "He did not come all this way for the view. He will give us an hour, maybe 2. Then he will come." "He let us go," Carrie argued. "He let the army take you," Kalen corrected. "He intends to take you back from the army when no one is watching. It is easier to kill one Navajo in the canyon than to fight a town full of witnesses." Carrie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. She looked at the back of the man leading her. "Who are you? Really? You aren't just an army scout?" Kalen was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the crunch of hooves on dry gravel. "My name is Kalen," he said finally, "and I was not sent by Major Sterling." Carrie froze. "The warrant?" "I stole the paper from a supply officer 2 months ago," Kalen admitted, his voice devoid of emotion. "It was for claiming 6 mules." Carrie stared at him, stunned. "You lied to the sheriff. You lied to Pike." "White men believe what is written on paper more than what they see with their eyes," Kalen said. "It is their weakness." "Then why are you here?" Carrie demanded. She spurred her horse forward so she was riding alongside him. "If the army didn't send you, who did?" Kalen looked at her then. His eyes were dark, tired, and old beyond his years. "Elias Pike sent me," he said. Carrie pulled her horse up short. Her hand went to her gun, but she didn't draw. Not yet. "What?" "Pike hired me 3 days ago in Santa Fe," Kalen explained, stopping his horse as well. "He needed a tracker who knew this land. He paid me $20 to find the track of the woman who killed the rancher's son. He told me she was a monster, a cold-blooded killer who slaughtered a man in his sleep." Carrie's grip on the reins tightened until her knuckles were white. "And you believed him?" "I took his money," Kalen said. "But then I came to Mesa Ridge. I listened to the wind. I listened to the people." He paused, his gaze dropping to the scar on her cheek, a faint white line from a childhood fall. "And I saw you in the saloon. Monsters do not drink whiskey with shaking hands. Monsters do not have eyes that look for the exit." He looked toward the distant purple mesas of the Navajo lands. I know what it is to be hunted for something you did not do, Kaelin said softly. I know what it is when the rich man writes the story and the poor man pays for it with his blood. So you are betraying him, Carrie said, trying to wrap her mind around it. You are betraying the man who paid you. I am returning his coin, Kaelin said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a gold coin. He tossed it into the dirt. Now the debt is cleared. He looked back at her. My goal was to find you. I found you. Now my goal is to keep you breathing. Why? Carrie asked, her suspicion still a high wall between them. What do you get out of it, a reward, Glory? Redemption, Kaelin said, the word heavy and strange in his mouth. I have guided many soldiers to many villages. I have watched them burn hogans and cut down peach trees. I cannot stop the army, but I can stop one man from hanging one woman. He turned his horse back to the south. We have a long ride, he said, and Pike is the best tracker I have ever seen, other than my own father. If we want to live, you will do exactly as I say. Carrie looked at the gold coin glinting in the red dust. She looked at the broad back of the Navajo warrior. He had claimed her in front of the town. She is mine. The words still stung, but now they carried a different weight. He hadn't claimed her as a prize. He had claimed her as a responsibility. She was still a prisoner, in a way. She was a prisoner of circumstance, bound to this man by the thread of a rope. But as she kicked the gray horse into motion, following him into the deepening shadows of the canyon, Carrie Hart realized one thing. For the first time in 6 months, she wasn't alone. Don't think this makes us friends, Carrie called out, her voice regaining its edge. Kaelin didn't look back, but she thought she saw the slightest shift in his shoulders, perhaps a shrug. I do not need a friend, he called back. I need a shooter who does not miss. Can you shoot? Caroline Hart. Carrie touched the handle of her peacemaker. I never miss. Good, Kaelin said. Because before the sun sets tomorrow, you will have to prove it. They rode on, 2 specks of life in a vast, indifferent landscape, while behind them, the dust of their pursuers began to rise against the darkening sky. The town had finished its gossip, and now the wolves were coming. The sun had begun its slow, bleeding descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and burnt orange. But the heat refused to break. It clung to the earth with a desperate, suffocating weight. Kaelin Yazzie pulled the Appaloosa to a halt, the animal's sides heaving rhythmically beneath the saddle. He looked back. The gray gelding Carrie rode was stumbling, its head low, foam lacing its neck. It was a strong horse, but it had been ridden hard by a desperate woman for too many miles before Kaelin had even found her. He is done, Kaelin said, his voice cutting through the dry silence. Carrie wiped a mixture of sweat and red dust from her forehead with the back of her hand. She glared at him, her hazel eyes still fierce despite the exhaustion dragging at her eyelids. He can keep going. I can keep going. He will die in 2 miles, Kaelin stated flatly. He swung down from his saddle, his boots crunching on the gravel. And you will be walking. We are losing time. Before Carrie could argue, Kaelin was beside her. He did not ask for permission. He reached up, his hands gripping her waist. They were large hands, calloused and firm. And for a second, Carrie stiffened, her hand dropping instinctively toward the empty holster at her hip. Her gun was currently tucked into Kaelin's belt. Get down, he ordered, not unkindly, but with the tone of a man who had no time for debate. He pulled her down. Her boots hit the ground, and her legs wobbled, numb from hours in the saddle. Kaelin steadied her, then immediately turned to unbuckle the cinch on the gray. He stripped the saddle and bridle, slapping the horse on the rump to send it wandering toward a patch of dry scrub grass. That is my horse, Carrie protested, her voice rising. You are just turning him loose. He will find water. He knows the land better than you, Kaelin said. He tied her saddlebags to his own saddle, then mounted the Appaloosa in one fluid motion. He looked down at her, extending a hand, Up, behind me. Carrie stared at the hand, then at the vast, empty desert stretching out in every direction. The reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. She was miles from nowhere, unarmed, with a man she did not trust, being hunted by a man she feared. She ignored his hand, grabbing the cantle of the saddle and swinging herself up behind him. The horse shifted under the extra weight. "Hold on," Kaylin said. "I will not hold on to you," Carrie muttered, gripping the leather of the saddle instead. Kaylin made a sound that might have been a laugh or a scoff. He kicked the horse into a gallop. The sudden surge of speed nearly threw Carrie backward. Instinct overrode pride. Her arms flew around his waist, her chest slamming against his broad back. The ride was a torture of intimacy. Every stride of the horse ground her body against his. She could feel the shifting of his muscles beneath his shirt, the heat radiating from him like a furnace. His scent filled her nose, not the stale whiskey and tobacco stink of the men in Mesa Ridge, but something earthier. He smelled of sagebrush, old leather, and the sharp tang of ozone. It was infuriating. "You are enjoying this, aren't you?" Carrie shouted over the wind, her cheek pressed unwillingly against his shoulder blade as the horse navigated a sharp turn. "Humiliating me?" Kaylin did not turn his head. "Survival is not humiliation, Caroline Hart. It is just survival." "My name is Carrie," she snapped, "and I don't need a savage telling me about survival." Kaylin tightened his grip on the reins. The word savage hung in the air between them, sharp and ugly. He had heard it 1,000 times, spoken by generals and drunks alike. It no longer angered him, but it reminded him of the wall that stood between them, a wall built of blood and history. "Hold tighter," was all he said. He steered them off the main trail, guiding the horse into the labyrinth of red rock canyons that marked the edge of the Navajo lands. The walls rose up on either side, towering cathedrals of sandstone carved by wind and time. The light here was dim, the air cooler but heavy with static. Kaylin felt the shift in the air before he saw it. The wind suddenly died. The birds, which had been circling the thermals, vanished. The silence that fell over the canyon was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. "Storm," he grunted. He pulled the horse to a skidding halt beneath a massive overhang of rock, a natural amphitheater carved into the cliff face. He dismounted quickly, pulling Carrie down after him. "What is it?" Carrie asked, looking at the sky. It had turned a sickly shade of greenish yellow. "Sandstorm," Kaylin said. He moved with efficient speed, forcing the horse to lie down near the back wall of the overhang, tying its legs loosely so it wouldn't bolt. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from his bedroll. "Get against the wall. Cover your face." The first gust hit them like a physical blow, a wall of stinging grit that turned the world into a brown blur. Carrie scrambled back against the cold stone. Kaylin was there an instant later. He sat beside her, pulling the blanket up over their heads, enclosing them in a small, dark tent. The wind howled outside, a screaming banshee that tore at the rocks. The sand hissed against the blanket, seeking any entry. Inside the darkness of the wool tent, the space was non-existent. Kaylin shifted, positioning himself to block the wind from her, his large frame acting as a shield. Carrie was forced to press herself against him, her knees knocking against his thighs. She could hear his breathing steady, slow, rhythmic. It was infuriatingly calm given the chaos outside. In the cramped dark, the boundaries of their hostility blurred. She felt the solid warmth of his chest, the strength in the arm that was braced against the wall behind her head. "You are heavy," she whispered, though she didn't push him away. She couldn't. "And you are loud," Kaylin replied, his voice rumbling in his chest, vibrating against her ribs. "I haven't said a word for 10 minutes, she argued. "Your mind is loud," he said. "It screams like a trapped rabbit." Carrie bristled. "I am not a rabbit. I am the one who is going to kill Elias Pike." "Pike is a wolf," Kaylin said softly. Rabbits do not kill wolves. They outrun them. Is that what you are doing? Carrie challenged, shifting slightly, her hand brushing against the firm line of his abdomen. She pulled it back as if burned. Running? Kaelin did not answer immediately. The wind roared, drowning out the world. I am leading him, Kaelin said finally. There is a difference. Carrie sat in the dark, processing this. She was conscious of every point of contact between them. His shoulder against hers, his leg pressing into hers. It was the closest she had been to a man without a weapon in her hand in years. It should have terrified her. She should have been sick with the memory of Colton Briggs's son, of the grabbing hands and the sour breath. But Kaelin did not grab. He did not press his advantage. He existed in the space beside her like a stone or a tree solid, present, but asking nothing of her. It was a strange, confusing kind of safety. It made her want to claw at him and curl into him at the same time. The storm raged for 2 hours. When the wind finally died down to a whimper, the sun had set. Kaelin threw off the blanket, shaking the red dust from its folds. The world outside was changed drifts of sand piled against the canyon walls. The air scrubbed clean and sharp. He built a small fire using dried sagebrush and driftwood, keeping the flames low to avoid being seen. They ate in silence strips of dried venison and stale biscuits. Kaelin took the first watch. He sat on a flat rock near the mouth of the overhang, his rifle across his knees, his eyes scanning the darkness. Carrie lay on the blanket, feigning sleep, but watching him through slitted eyes. The firelight danced over his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the stoic set of his mouth. He looked lonely. She thought, not the loneliness of someone who has no one, but the loneliness of someone who has chosen to stand apart. Kaelin stared into the dark, but his mind was miles and years away. He was remembering the Canyon de Chelly. He was remembering the blue coats of the soldiers, the men he had guided, thinking he was helping his people negotiate peace. He remembered the general's promise: peace, water, and land. He remembered the burning hogans, the peach orchards, cut down to the stumps, the women weeping as they were herded like cattle. He had been a boy then, a scout who thought he was a warrior. He had learned that day that the white man's word was written in water. And now, here he was, risking his life for a white woman, a woman whose people had taken everything. He looked back at Carrie. She was curled on her side, her breathing even. She was small, he thought, too small to carry so much hate. He felt a pang of something he didn't want to name, a recognition of a kindred spirit. She was broken, just as he was. He turned back to the dark. He would get her to safety. Then he would disappear. That was the deal he made with his ghosts. But Carrie was not sleeping. She waited until the moon was high, and Kaelin's head dipped slightly, his breathing deepening into a meditative rhythm. She knew he wasn't fully asleep. Men like him never were, but she hoped he was deep enough in his trance. She moved her hand slowly to her boot. Tucked inside the leather was a sharp piece of flint she had palmed during the storm. She sat up, inching backward away from the firelight. Her eyes were on him. He didn't move. She crawled toward the Appaloosa. The horse snorted softly, shifting its weight. Carrie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Kaelin didn't stir. She reached the horse, her hands trembling as she untied the hobbles. She didn't have time to saddle it. She would have to ride bareback. She grabbed the mane, swinging herself up. The horse spooked at the sudden weight and movement. It whinnied loudly, a sound that shattered the canyon silence. Carrie? Kaelin's voice was a whip crack. He was on his feet instantly, the rifle in his hand. Carrie kicked the horse's flanks. Go ya! The Appaloosa bolted, scrabbling for traction on the slick rock. Carrie crouched low over its neck, guiding it toward the canyon exit. She didn't look back. She just rode, fueled by the desperate, irrational need to be free, to be the one holding the reins of her own life. She rode for 10 minutes, the wind tearing at her hair. The canyon floor was treacherous in the moonlight, full of shadows and drop-offs. She heard the sound of running feet behind her. Not a horse, a man running. She risked a glance back. Kalen was there. He was running with an inhuman stamina, taking shortcuts over the rocks, cutting off her angles. He knew this terrain. She did not. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "The ridge!" Carrie didn't listen. She saw a path leading up and took it, urging the horse higher. She needed the high ground. She needed to see. The path narrowed. The horse's breathing was ragged. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave way. It wasn't a path. It was a washout, ending abruptly in a sheer drop of 300 feet into the black void of the canyon floor. The Appaloosa screamed, sliding on its haunches, its front hooves pawing at the empty air. Carrie was thrown forward, her fingers tangling in the mane. She stared down into the abyss, the world tilting sickeningly. The horse was slipping, the loose shale giving way under its weight. "Don't move." A hand grabbed her belt. Kalen anchored himself against a boulder, his boots digging into the gravel. With a roar of exertion, he pulled. He hauled Carrie backward off the horse just as the animal found its footing and scrambled back to safety. Carrie flew back, landing hard against Kalen's chest. They tumbled together onto the dusty ground, rolling away from the edge. They came to a stop with Kalen on top of her, his forearms bracketing her head, pinning her to the earth. Carrie gasped, her lungs burning. She looked up. Kalen's face was inches from hers. His chest was heaving, his heart pounding so hard she could feel it against her own ribs. For a moment, time suspended. She waited for the anger. She waited for him to hit her, to curse her for stealing his horse, for being a fool. But there was no anger in his eyes. There was terror. His pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. His skin was pale beneath the dust. His hand, which was tangled in her hair to keep her head from hitting the rocks, was shaking. "You foolish girl," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You almost died." It wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Carrie stared at him, her own defiance crumbling in the face of his raw, naked fear. He wasn't afraid of her. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. In a world where men looked at her and saw a target, a prize, or a whore, this man looked at her and saw a life worth saving. The tension shifted. The adrenaline of the near-death experience morphed into something else, the electric current that arced between them. She felt the weight of his hips, the hardness of his chest, the warmth of his breath on her lips. It was intimate, terrifyingly so. Kalen seemed to realize their position at the same moment. His eyes dropped to her lips, then snapped back to her eyes. He flinched, as if waking from a dream, and pushed himself off her. He scrambled backward, putting 5 feet of distance between them. He stood up, turning his back to her, running a hand through his hair. "Get up," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Get the horse." Carrie sat up slowly, her body trembling. She wrapped her arms around herself. "Kalen." "Don't," he cut her off. He walked to the edge of the cliff, looking down, composing himself. He froze. "Carrie," he said. His tone completely changed. It was the voice of the scout again, cold, professional. "Come here." Carrie got to her feet and walked to his side, careful not to touch him. She followed his gaze. Down in the canyon, perhaps 2 miles back the way they had come, a fire was burning. It was small, but distinct in the darkness, and near it, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, were the shapes of 3 horses. "He is closer than I thought," Kalen said grimly. "He tracked us through the storm." "Pike?" Carrie asked. "Pike," Kalen confirmed. "And he is not stopping for the night." He turned to her. The moment on the ground was gone, buried under the necessity of survival. But something had changed. The wall between them had a crack in it. "You want to run, Caroline?" Kaylin asked, looking her in the eye. "You want to be free?" "Yes," she said, though the word felt less certain than before. "Then you have a choice," he said. "You can take the horse and ride off that cliff in the dark, or you can trust me, and we fight him together." Carrie looked at the fire in the distance. She thought of Pike's dead eyes. Then she looked at Kaylin, the man who had pulled her back from the edge. "I can't shoot if I don't have a gun," she said. Kaylin reached into his belt and pulled out her Colt Peacemaker. He spun it in his hand, offering it to her. Handle first. It was a gesture of immense trust. He was arming the prisoner. "Do not make me regret this," he said. Carrie took the gun. The weight of it felt like a part of her soul returning. She holstered it, the leather creaking softly. "I won't shoot you, Kaylin," she said. "Not tonight." "That is a start," he said. "Let's move. We need the high ground before he finds our tracks." They walked back to the horse together. Carrie didn't fight him when he helped her up. As they rode deeper into the night, the silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the unspoken knowledge that they were no longer just captor and captive. They were partners in a game where the only prize was seeing the sun rise. The hidden valley was a shock of green in a world of red stone. After days of riding through the labyrinthine canyons where the sun baked the rocks into anvils, the sudden appearance of cottonwood trees and a ribbon of silver water felt like a hallucination. Kaylin did not slow the Appaloosa as they descended the narrow switchback trail, the hooves of their horses clicking rhythmically against the shale. Carrie sat stiffly in her saddle, her spine rigid. She could feel the eyes before she saw the people. The Navajo camp was not a haphazard collection of tents, but a settled place of hogans built from logs and packed earth, their doorways facing the rising sun. Smoke drifted lazily from the roof vents, carrying the scent of roasted corn and burning cedar, but the tranquility was a mask. As Kaylin rode in, the camp stopped. Women weaving blankets beneath the shade of the trees froze, their hands hovering over the looms. Men sharpening tools or tending to horses stood up, their postures shifting from relaxed to defensive. Children, who had been playing with sticks in the dirt, were snatched up by their mothers and pulled into the folds of skirts. They did not look at Kaylin with the warmth of a returning hero. They looked at him with a complicated mix of relief and suspicion. But when their eyes shifted to Carrie, the suspicion hardened into open hostility. "Stay close," Kaylin murmured, his voice low. "I don't need you to tell me that," Carrie replied, though she nudged the gray horse closer to his flank. She kept her hand near the Colt Peacemaker, not touching it, but letting the leather of the holster creak as a warning. A group of men blocked their path near the central fire. They were older, their face lined like the canyon walls, wearing a mix of traditional deerskin and cast-off army trousers. One of them, a man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stepped forward. He spoke in the Dine language, his words sharp and guttural. Carrie did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the universal sound of an unwanted guest being shown the door. Kaylin answered in the same tongue, his voice calm but firm. He gestured to Carrie, then to the south, then back to the ground beneath his boots. The argument grew heated. The man with the scar pointed at Carrie and spat a word that sounded like Thlianlani. "What did he call me?" Carrie asked under her breath. Kaylin didn't look at her. "Many horses. It means wild horse. It is not a compliment. It means something that cannot be led and is of no use to the herd." "Tell him I have been called worse by better men," Carrie said, lifting her chin. The elder switched to broken English, his eyes narrowing at her defiance. "White woman brings trouble. Blue coats follow white woman like flies follow rot. We do not want her here, Yazzie." "She is under my protection," Kaylin said, switching to English as well, making sure the gathered crowd could understand. "Protection," another elder scoffed. "Trade her. The soldiers will give us blankets and beef for her, or the rancher Briggs will give us back the grazing rights to the lower creek." Carrie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She was back to being a currency, a poker chip to be tossed onto the table. Her hand twitched toward her gun, her instinct to fight flaring up like a match struck on sandpaper. "She is not a goat to be traded," Kalen said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a sudden, dangerous intensity. He rode his horse forward a step, forcing the elders to give ground. "She is a life, and she stays." The tension in the air was brittle enough to snap. The tribe looked at Kalen, seeing the army scout who wore the clothes of the white man, but hearing the voice of a warrior who would not be moved. Before the violence could erupt, a voice cut through the standoff. It was dry and raspy, like wind blowing through dead leaves. "Let the boy down from his horse." The crowd parted. An old woman walked forward. She was small, shrunken by age, wrapped in a blanket of vivid red and black wool. Her hair was white, tied back with yarn, and her face was a map of 1,000 winters. She leaned on a gnarled stick, but her eyes were bright black beads that missed nothing. "Atsa," Kalen said, inclining his head with a respect he had not shown the men. Atsa ignored him. She walked straight to Carrie's horse. She reached up, her withered hand gripping the bridle of the skittish gray gelding. The horse, usually ready to bite any stranger, lowered its head and blew softly against her palm. "You have the eyes of a cornered coyote," Atsa said, looking up at Carrie. "Get down." Carrie hesitated, then swung down from the saddle. She towered over the old woman, but she felt strangely small. "Who are you running from, wild horse?" Atsa asked. "Everyone," Carrie answered honestly. Atsa made a sound of amusement in her throat. "Then you will fit in well here. Come, you will work for your water." The diffusing of the situation was absolute. The elders grumbled, but dispersed. Kalen dismounted. Letting out a breath he seemed to have been holding since they entered the valley. He looked at Carrie, a silent message passing between them. "You are safe for now, but walk softly." The days that followed were a lesson in humility. Carrie Hart, who could rope a steer in 20 seconds and shoot a bottle off a fence post at 50 paces, found herself struggling to keep up with the rhythm of the camp. She was not treated as a guest. She was put to work. She hauled water from the creek in heavy clay jars, her shoulders aching. She ground corn until her palms were blistered, and all the while, she was watched. Atsa was her shadow. The old woman did not speak much, but when she did, it was to probe. One evening, as the sun dipped below the canyon rim and the air turned purple, they sat by a small fire outside Atsa's hogan. Carrie was mending a tear in her duster, her needle flashing in the firelight. "They say you killed a man," Atsa said. It wasn't a question. Carrie didn't look up. "They say a lot of things. They say you killed the son of the big man Briggs because he did not pay you for your bed." Atsa continued, her voice devoid of judgment, simply testing the weight of the rumor. Carrie stopped sewing. The needle pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood welling up. The anger that she usually used as a shield flared hot, but looking into Atsa's ancient eyes, she felt the need to drop the weight of the lie. "He didn't owe me money," Carrie said, her voice low. "He owed me nothing but decency, and he didn't have any—" She looked into the fire, seeing the flames of the burning barn from 3 years ago. "I found him down by the river," Carrie said. "He was drunk. He had cornered a boy, one of yours, a Navajo boy, maybe 12 years old. The boy had strayed onto Briggs's land to find a lost sheep. Colton's son was using him for target practice, shooting at his feet, laughing." Atsa went very still. "I told him to stop," Carrie continued, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the memory of the rage. "He turned on me. He said if I liked Indians so much, maybe he should treat me like one. He came at me. He tore my dress. I fought him. The gun went off in the struggle. I didn't mean to kill him, but I am not sorry he is dead." The silence stretched. Carrie waited for the condemnation. She waited to be told she was a liar. And the boy, Atsa asked. He ran, Carrie said. I yelled at him to run. Briggs found his son's body in the tracks. He couldn't admit his son was killed by a girl defending a Navajo. So he made up the story about the robbery and the murder. He burned my ranch to cover the evidence. Atsa reached out, her dry hand covering Carrie's shaking one. The boy came home, the old woman said softly. His name is Hastian. He told us a spirit woman with fire in her hair saved him. We thought it was a story of fear. Carrie looked up, her eyes stinging. You wear your sharpness like a coat, Atsa said, tapping Carrie's chest. You growl so no one sees you are bleeding. It is a good way to survive, but it is a lonely way to live. From that night on, the mood in the camp shifted. The glare softened. The women began to nod at her when she passed. She was no longer just the white woman who brought trouble. She was the one who had stood between a wolf and one of their lambs. Kalen saw the change, but he kept his distance. He spent his days patrolling the rim of the valley, watching the horizon for the dust of Pike's posse. But in the late afternoons, he would find her. You walk like a cow, he told her one day, watching her trudge through the brush. Carrie wiped sweat from her brow. And you talk like a donkey. You leave tracks a blind man could follow, Kalen said, ignoring her jab. If you want to live, you must learn to walk without the earth knowing you are there. He began to teach her. It was not formal schooling. It was a series of challenges. He taught her to step on the balls of her feet, to roll her weight so that dried twigs did not snap. He taught her to read the wind, to smell the moisture in the air that signaled a hidden spring. He made her a bow from ash wood. Guns are loud, he said. Guns tell the enemy exactly where you are. This speaks in a whisper. Carrie struggled with the bow. The string slapped her forearm, leaving angry red welts, but she did not quit. She shot until her fingers bled, until she could hit a rabbit at 30 paces. Each time she succeeded, she would look to him for praise. He never gave it. He would simply nod, a single, sharp dip of his chin. But in that nod, Carrie felt a warmth that terrified her more than his scorn ever had. It was respect. She began to watch him, too. She saw the way the other men in the tribe treated him with a wary distance. They took the supplies he brought from his wages as a scout, but they did not invite him to the council fires. You are an outsider here, too, Carrie said to him one afternoon as they watered the horses. Kalen stiffened. This is my home. Is it? Carrie asked gently. They look at you like you are half ghost. You wear the white man's clothes to walk in his world, but his world hates you, and your world doesn't trust you because of the clothes. Kalen looked at her, his dark eyes unguarded for a fleeting second. I stand in the doorway, he said, his voice heavy. It is the only way to keep the door from slamming shut on my people. Carrie realized then that his coldness was not arrogance. It was armor, just like her untamable reputation. They were two people wearing costumes of iron to keep the world from crushing them. The peace of the valley could not last. It was shattered 2 weeks after their arrival. Kalen had gone to scout the northern ridge. He returned just after moonrise, not riding, but sliding from his horse. Carrie was the first to reach him. She saw the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of his canvas shirt. Pike, she asked, grabbing his good arm to steady him. Scouts, Kalen gritted out, his face pale. 3 of them. I stopped them, but one got lucky. He stumbled. Carrie caught his weight, buckling slightly under the heavy frame of the warrior. Help me, she shouted to the camp, but then she shook her head. No, the cave, the upper cave. If they see you bleeding, the elders will panic. She dragged him not to the center of the camp, but up the narrow path to a small sandstone cave set into the cliff wall, a place he had shown her where he kept a cache of weapons. She lowered him onto a pile of furs. The firelight from the small hearth danced on the walls. Let me see it, Carrie commanded. Her voice was steady, her hands moving with a purpose that overrode her fear. It is a scratch, Kalen muttered. trying to push her away. "Leave it." "Shut up, Kaylin," she said softly. She reached for the buttons of his shirt. His hand came up to stop her, gripping her wrist. His skin was burning hot. For a moment, they froze her small, pale hand trapped in his large, dark one. The contact was electric, a sudden jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with the wound. He looked at her, his eyes hazy with pain but sharp with intent. Then, slowly, his fingers relaxed. He let her hand go. Carrie unbuttoned the shirt and peeled the fabric back. The wound was a nasty gouge along the deltoid, deep and bleeding freely, but the bullet had passed through. "I need to clean it," she said. "This will hurt." She took a water skin and a clean cloth. She poured water over the wound. Kaylin's back arched off the furs, a hiss of air escaping his teeth. But he did not cry out. His muscles bunched under her hands, hard as ironwood. Carrie worked in silence, washing away the blood. She applied a poultice of sage and yarrow that Atsa had taught her to make, then bound the shoulder tight with strips of clean linen. When she was finished, she didn't pull away. She sat back on her heels, her hands resting on his bare chest. She could feel the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath her palms. She looked at his chest. It was a landscape of violence. There were old scars from knives, the puckered mark of a previous bullet wound, and the faint, white lines of a whip across his ribs. "You have been fighting a long time," she whispered, tracing one of the scars with her fingertip. Kaylin watched her hand. He felt the ghost of her touch trailing fire across his skin. He had spent years training himself not to feel, to be a weapon, to be a stone, but this woman, this wild, infuriating creature, was cracking the stone. "Since I was a boy," he rasped, "the world is a fight." "It doesn't have to be," Carrie said, her voice trembling. "Not in here." She looked up at his face. The firelight softened the harsh angles of his jaw. The predator was gone, leaving only the man. "I almost gave you back to them," Kaylin confessed. The words seemed to be torn from him. "That day in the canyon, before the storm, I thought about tying you to a tree and leaving you for Pike. I thought it would save the tribe." Carrie did not flinch. "I know. And I thought about shooting you in your sleep and taking your horse." They looked at each other. The ugly truths of their survival instincts laid bare between them. There was no judgment, only a profound recognition. "But you didn't," Carrie said. "No," Kaylin said. "I didn't. And I didn't shoot you," she added. Kaylin raised his good hand. He hesitated, then reached out, his knuckles brushing the line of her jaw. His touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of his life. "You are not a wild horse, Caroline," he whispered. "You are just a woman who has forgotten what it is to be safe." Carrie leaned into his hand, her eyes fluttering shut. A tear leaked out, hot and fast. "I don't know how to be safe. I only know how to run." "Then stop running," Kaylin said. He leaned forward. Carrie met him halfway. The kiss was not the crashing of waves. It was the settling of dust after a storm. It was slow, tentative, tasting of smoke and salt and unsaid words. His lips were firm, warm, and demanding in a way that asked rather than took. Carrie felt the walls she had built around her heart crumbling. For years, a man's touch had meant danger. It had meant ownership. But this was an offering. Kaylin pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breath mingled with hers. He could feel the trembling in her body, the fight and the surrender warring within her. "I am not Colton Briggs," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "And I am not the men in the saloon." He moved his hand to the back of her neck, his thumb stroking the pulse point there. "You are mine to protect," he said, reclaiming the words he had spoken in the town, but changing their meaning entirely. "But I will take nothing from you, Caroline, that you do not choose to give. If you want me to stop, I stop. If you want to leave, you leave." Carrie opened her eyes. She saw her own reflection in his dark gaze. She didn't see the untamable girl or the wanted killer. She saw a woman who was tired of being alone. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. She kissed him again, and this time there was no hesitation. She broke through his guard, not with a bullet, but with a surrender that was braver than any gunfight. In the quiet of the cave, while the wind howled outside, the warrior and the wild girl found the one thing they had both been denied: a place to rest. The morning brought a cold light and colder news. Carrie woke to find Kalen already up, checking his rifle by the cave entrance. He moved stiffly, favoring his shoulder, but the distance in his eyes was gone. When he looked at her, there was a softness that made her chest ache. But the moment was shattered by the sound of shouting from the valley floor. They hurried down the path. A scout on a lathered horse had arrived, surrounded by the elders. The camp was in chaos. "What is it?" Carrie asked, grabbing Atsa's arm. Atsa looked grave. "The wind brings bad words from Mesa Ridge." Kalen stepped out of the circle of men, his face grim. He looked at Carrie, and the protector's mask slammed back into place. "Colton Briggs is not just sending bounty hunters anymore," Kalen said. "What is he doing?" Carrie asked, feeling the dread pool in her stomach. "He is gathering men," Kalen said. "He has gone to the fort. He is telling the colonel that the Navajo have kidnapped a white woman, that we are torturing you, that we are savages who need to be put down." Carrie gasped. "He is using me." "He is using you as an excuse," Kalen corrected. "He doesn't care about you. He wants the water in this valley. He wants the grazing land. And now, he has the United States cavalry to help him take it." The elders looked at Carrie with renewed fear. The prophecy of trouble had come true. "They come to kill us," the man with the scar shouted. "Because of her." "No!" Kalen roared, silencing the crowd. "They come because they are greedy. If she was not here, they would find another reason." But Carrie could see the truth in their eyes. She was the spark. If she stayed, the fire would consume them all. She looked at Kalen. He was ready to fight for her. He was ready to die for her. And because she had captured his heart, she knew she could not let him do it. The rising action had crested. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. The dust cloud on the horizon was not a storm. It was a promise of violence. From the ridge overlooking the hidden valley, the sight of the approaching force was enough to curdle the blood in the veins of the bravest men. It was a column of riders, a snake of dark intent winding its way through the red rocks, the sun glinting off rifle barrels and brass buttons. Kalen lowered his spyglass, his jaw set in a line of grim resignation. "Blue coats," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And civilians. Too many of them." Beside him, the Navajo elder with the scarred face spat on the ground. "They come for the land. Yazzie, the woman is just the key they needed to unlock the gate." Below them, in the camp, the panic was a tangible thing. Mothers were gathering children, their eyes wide with the terror of memory. They remembered the long walk. They remembered the burning hogans. The arrival of the cavalry never meant anything but death or displacement. Kalen turned to Carrie, who stood a few paces back, her face pale beneath the layer of canyon dust. She had seen the flag of the United States Army fluttering at the head of the column, flanked by the distinctive black coats of Colton Briggs's hired guns. "They are going to wipe us out," Carrie whispered. "Because of me." "No," Kalen said firmly, stepping between her and the sight of the approaching doom. "Briggs wants this valley. It has water. It has grass. If you were not here, he would have claimed we stole cattle. He would have claimed we attacked a wagon train. He is a man who eats the world. Caroline, you are just the seasoning." But the logic did not stop the murmurs rising from the warriors gathering near the horses. The debate had turned ugly. "Give her to them," a young brave shouted, pointing an accusing finger at Carrie. Tie her up and leave her on the ridge. Maybe they will take her and go." "They will take her, hang her, and then kill us anyway for harboring her." Atsa's voice cracked like a whip. The old woman stood before the men, small but fierce. "We do not trade lives for a few more hours of breath. That is the way of cowards." Kalen stood in the center of the storm, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. He was torn. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to defend his people, to lead them into the rocks where they could fight a guerrilla war against the soldiers. But he looked at the women huddled by the stream. He looked at the old men who could not run. A war now would be a massacre. Carrie watched him. She saw the crack in his armor. He was trying to hold up the sky with his bare hands. She realized then that her presence was the poison in the well. As long as she was hidden here, Colton Briggs held the moral high ground. He was the grieving father seeking justice. He was the civilized man rescuing a white woman from savages. She tightened her belt. The decision settled in her gut, cold and heavy as a stone. "I am going back," Carrie announced. The argument stopped. Kalen spun around, his eyes wide. "What?" "I am going back to Mesa Ridge," Carrie said, her voice gaining strength. "I am going to ride down there, past them, and I am going to stand in the middle of that town and tell them the truth. I am going to strip Colton Briggs of his excuses." "That is suicide," Kalen growled, stepping close to her, invading her space to intimidate her into silence. "Hale will shoot you before you open your mouth. Pike will put a bullet in your back." "Maybe," Carrie said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But if I stay here, your people die. All of them. I will not have that blood on my soul. Kalen, I have enough ghosts." She moved toward the gray horse, but Kalen grabbed her arm. His grip was hard, desperate. "You do not understand," he said, his voice dropping to a ragged whisper. "They will hang you. I cannot let you do that." "You don't have a choice," Carrie said softly. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, gently prying his fingers loose. "You said I was yours to protect. The best way to protect me and your family is to let me fight this my way, with the truth." Kalen looked at her. He saw the fire in her hazel eyes, the same fire that had kept her alive in the desert. She was not a damsel needing a savior. She was a warrior choosing her battlefield. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He turned to the elder with the scar. "Prepare the people to move to the high caves," Kalen ordered in Navajo. "If we do not return by sundown, seal the passes." "We?" Carrie asked. Kalen turned back to her, checking the load in his Winchester rifle. "You are a terrible liar, Caroline Hart. You will need a witness, and you will need someone to keep Pike off your back long enough for you to speak." "I don't need an owner," she warned, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I am not your owner," Kalen said, swinging onto his Appaloosa. He looked down at her, and for the first time, a small, dark smile touched his lips. "I am just the man who rides beside you." They left the valley not by the main trail, but by a goat path that wound precariously along the eastern rim. It was a dangerous route, narrow and crumbling, but it kept them hidden from the army's scouts below. The heat was ferocious. The sun was a white hole in the sky, bleaching the color from the world. They rode hard, pushing the horses to the limit of their endurance. They were 3 miles from Mesa Ridge, navigating a narrow slot canyon, when the ambush came. It was not a full assault. It was a single shot, a crack of thunder that echoed off the canyon walls. A bullet struck the rock inches from Kalen's head, sending a spray of stone shards into his face. "Down!" Kalen roared, throwing himself from his horse and dragging Carrie with him. They hit the dirt behind a fallen slab of sandstone just as a second shot whined through the air where Carrie's chest had been a second before. "Pike!" Kalen hissed, wiping blood from a shallow cut on his cheek. "He didn't join the main column. He waited. He knew we would try to flank them." "Where is he?" Carrie asked, clutching her Colt Peacemaker, her eyes scanning the rim of the canyon above them. Up high, east wall. He has a Sharp's rifle. He can pin us here all day." "We don't have all day," Carrie said. "Briggs will be in the town by noon." Kaylin looked at the terrain. There was no cover for 50 yards ahead. If they moved, they died, unless one of them drew the fire. "When I move, you run for the horses," Kaylin said. "No," Carrie began, but Kaylin was already moving. He didn't run away. He broke cover and sprinted toward a cluster of boulders on the opposite side of the trail, firing his Winchester blindly at the rim to suppress the shooter. A boom echoed from the cliffs. Kaylin dived. Dust geysered up near his boots. It gave Carrie the split second she needed. She didn't run for the horses to flee. She steadied her pistol on the rock, aiming not at the rim, but at a precarious overhang of shale directly above where she saw the puff of gun smoke. She fired, once, twice, 3 times. The heavy .45 caliber slugs smashed into the fragile rock formation. It wasn't enough to kill a man, but it was enough to shatter the unstable shelf. A cascade of rocks and debris rained down on the sniper's nest. A shout of pain echoed down the canyon, followed by the clatter of a rifle falling against stone. "He is hit!" Kaylin shouted, scrambling up. "Or he is buried. Move!" They reached the horses. As they galloped past the section of the cliff, Carrie looked up. She saw a figure struggling in the rocks, clutching a leg that was pinned under a boulder. It was Pike. He was alive, his eyes burning with hate, but he was trapped. Kaylin slowed. Raising his rifle, he had a clear shot. He could end the threat of Elias Pike forever. Carrie put a hand on his barrel, pushing it down. "Leave him. Let him live with his failure. We need to get to the town." Kaylin hesitated, the warrior's instinct demanding the kill, but he nodded. They spurred their horses, leaving the bounty hunter cursing in the dust, a specter of violence left in their wake. Mesa Ridge was in a state of festive agitation. The news had spread that Colton Briggs had returned with the army to flush out the rats. The saloon was empty, the shops closed. The entire population had gathered in the town square. In the center of the dusty plaza, a wagon had been pulled up. Standing on it was Colton Briggs. He looked like a king in his Sunday suit, sweating profusely, holding a Bible in one hand and a hat in the other. Behind him, Sheriff Hale stood nervously, his hand hovering near his gun. To the side, a temporary gallows had been erected, a stark, wooden promise of what awaited the untamable girl. "Citizens," Briggs bellowed, his voice booming. "We have tolerated lawlessness for too long. The savages have taken a white woman. They have defiled our borders today. We take back what is ours today. Justice comes to Mesa Ridge." The crowd cheered, fueled by fear and the free whiskey Briggs had provided earlier. "Justice!" someone shouted. "Hang the witch!" another cried, the mob confusing their hatred for the Navajo with their hatred for Carrie. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was lost in the roar of the crowd until it was too late. Carrie and Kaylin did not sneak into town. They came down the main street at a full gallop, side by side. The gray horse and the Appaloosa cut through the edge of the crowd, forcing men to scatter. Carrie pulled her horse up hard right in front of the wagon. The gray reared, its hooves pawing the air, dust swirling around them like a cloak. Kaylin stopped beside her, his rifle resting across his saddle, leveled directly at Sheriff Hale. The square went silent. The visual was striking the wild woman in her duster, hair loose and tangled, beside the dark, imposing figure of the Navajo warrior. They looked like spirits summoned from the desert floor. "You speak of justice, Colton!" Carrie shouted, her voice raspy but projecting to the back of the crowd. She did not dismount. She sat tall, looking down at the man who had hunted her. Briggs turned a shade of purple. "Seize her, Hale, shoot him." "Anyone touches a gun, the sheriff dies first," Kaylin announced. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so. The deputies, seeing the dark bore of the Winchester, froze. "You are a liar." "Colton Briggs," Carrie yelled, turning her horse to face the townsfolk. She saw the doctor, the grocer, the women she had traded with. "He tells you I killed his son in cold blood. He tells you the Navajo are savages."
"Shut her up!"
Briggs screamed, dropping his Bible. "I killed your son because he was a rapist." Carrie's voice broke, raw with the memory, but she pushed through. "He cornered me, and he cornered a 12-year-old Navajo boy named Hastian. He shot that child for sport, and when I tried to stop him, he turned on me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story they had been told.
"She lies,"
Briggs roared.
"She is a whore protecting her Indian lover."
"Ask Dr. Miller." Carrie pointed at the town doctor, a gray-haired man standing on the boardwalk. "Ask him about the boy I brought to the edge of town 3 years ago. The boy with the bullet hole in his foot. You patched him up. Doctor, you remember." All eyes turned to Dr. Miller. The old man looked at Briggs, then at Carrie. He took a step forward, removing his hat. "I remember," Dr. Miller said, his voice shaking but clear. "I treated a Navajo boy. 3 years back, gunshot wound. I thought it was an accident." "It was no accident," Carrie cried. "And now Briggs wants to slaughter a valley full of women and children to bury his son's sins. He wants the water, he wants the land, and he is using you, all of you, to do his dirty work." The mood of the mob shifted. It swung from bloodlust to confusion. The truth, spoken with such raw conviction, had a weight that Briggs's bluster could not match. Colton Briggs saw his empire crumbling. He saw the doubt in the eyes of his neighbors. He looked up at the roof of the hotel, searching.
"Now!"
Briggs screamed. Kalen saw the glint of metal on the hotel roof a fraction of a second before the shot. It was not Pike. Pike was trapped in the canyon. It was one of Briggs's hired guns, a failsafe. Carrie... Kalen threw himself from his horse, not away from the danger, but toward her. He shoved Carrie hard, knocking her from the saddle just as the rifle cracked. The bullet meant for her heart slammed into Kalen's shoulder, the same shoulder that had been grazed days before. The impact spun him around, and he fell heavily into the dust. The spell broke. The town erupted into chaos. "They are shooting!" a woman screamed. Kalen groaned, blood soaking his shirt. But he rolled onto his back, lifting his Winchester with one arm. He saw the gunman on the roof cycling the bolt for a second shot. Kalen fired, one-handed. The gunman on the roof jerked backward, his rifle tumbling to the street, followed a second later by his body. It was a shot that defied logic, a shot born of pure desperation.
"Get them!"
Briggs yelled, pulling a revolver from his coat.
"Kill them both!"
Hale drew his gun, but before he could level it at Carrie, a shotgun blast tore into the dirt at his feet. "Drop it, Sheriff!" It was Dr. Miller. He was holding a double-barreled shotgun, his hands trembling, but his face set. Beside him, the grocer had pulled a pistol from his apron.
"We have heard enough. Colton!"
the grocer shouted.
"No more killing."
Briggs looked around wildly. His hired hands were hesitating, seeing the townsfolk turning against them. He was alone. Carrie scrambled to her feet, spitting dust. She looked for Kalen. He was alive, trying to stand, his face gray with pain. Briggs saw her. His eyes were manic. He realized he had lost the town, but his hatred for the woman who had ruined him was greater than his survival instinct. He lunged before anyone could shoot. Briggs grabbed Carrie by her hair, yanking her backward. He jammed the barrel of his revolver against her temple.
"Back off!"
Briggs screamed, using her as a shield. "I will kill her. I swear to God I will paint the street with her brains." The square froze. The silence was absolute, broken only by the heavy breathing of the men and the whinny of a frightened horse. Kalen was on one knee, 10 feet away. His gun was empty. His right arm hung useless. He looked at Carrie. His eyes were filled with a terrifying helplessness. He could not save her this time. Carrie felt the cold metal against her skin. She smelled the sweat and expensive cologne of the man who hated her. She felt his hand trembling. She looked at Kaylin. She remembered the cave. She remembered the lessons. You are not a rabbit. You are a warrior. She didn't wait for a rescue. Carrie stomped her heel down onto Briggs's instep with all her strength. As he gasped, she didn't pull away. She dropped her weight and spun, driving her elbow backward, not into his stomach, but high and hard, aiming for the wrist of the hand holding the gun. It was a move Kaylin had taught her to break a hold, bone against bone. There was a sickening crunch. Briggs shrieked, his grip on the gun loosening as his wrist fractured. The revolver clattered to the ground. Carrie didn't stop. She dove for the loose gun. Briggs, howling in pain, reached for a derringer hidden in his vest with his good hand. Bang! The shot didn't come from Carrie. Kaylin had drawn the Colt Peacemaker from his belt with his left hand, his offhand. He fired from the ground. The bullet didn't kill Briggs. It smashed into his remaining hand, blowing the derringer apart and shattering his fingers. Colton Briggs fell to his knees, cradling his ruined hands, screaming at the sky. He was not dead, but he was broken, completely and utterly broken. Carrie stood over him, breathing hard. The sheriff's gun in her hand, she leveled it at his head. The crowd held its breath. She had every right. This was the West. No jury would convict her. She looked at Briggs. Then she looked at Kaylin. The Navajo warrior was slumped against a water trough, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He was watching her. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't tell her to shoot. He let her choose. Carrie slowly lowered the hammer of the gun. She would not be the monster they said she was. "It is over, Colton," she said, her voice ringing in the silence. From the steps of the courthouse, a tall, thin man in a black robe stepped forward. It was Judge Holloway. He had watched the entire proceedings from the shadows. "Sheriff Hale," the judge said, his voice dry as old parchment. "You are relieved of your duties. Dr. Miller, see to Mr. Yazzy's wounds. Someone put irons on Mr. Briggs." The judge looked at Carrie. "And someone get Miss Hart a chair," the judge said. "I believe we have a deposition to take." The townsfolk rushed forward, not to attack, but to help. Hands reached out to grab Briggs. The doctor ran to Kaylin. Carrie dropped the gun in the dirt. She walked through the dust toward Kaylin. He looked up at her, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. "You missed his head," Kaylin rasped, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. "I wasn't aiming for his head," Carrie said, kneeling beside him. She pressed her hand against his wound to staunch the flow. "I didn't want him to die easy." "You fought well, wild horse," Kaylin whispered, his eyes closing as the adrenaline faded. "I had a good teacher," Carrie said, tears finally cutting tracks through the dust on her face. She looked around the square. The army soldiers were standing down, their officer conferring with the judge. The Navajo elders would be safe. The lie was dead. Carrie Hart had walked into the lion's den and walked out, but as she held the warrior who had bled for her, she knew she hadn't done it alone. She had claimed her freedom, but in doing so, she had bound herself to him more tightly than any rope ever could. The sun that set over Mesa Ridge that evening did not look like the angry, bloodshot eye that had glared down on the town for the past week. It was softer, a bruised purple spreading across the horizon, signaling the end of the heat and the end of an era. The silence that filled the streets was heavy, not with tension, but with exhaustion. Colton Briggs was gone. He had not died in the dirt as perhaps he deserved, but his fate was arguably worse for a man of his vanity. With both hands shattered, one by the heel of a woman's boot and the other by a bullet from a Navajo's gun, he had been dragged to the jailhouse screaming like a child. The townspeople, who had feared him for 2 decades, watched him weep, and in that weeping, his power evaporated. A king who cries over his own broken bones is no longer a king. He is just a man in a suit that costs too much money. Sheriff Hale had been stripped of his badge right there in the square. Judge Holloway, a man who had spent years drinking away his conscience, seemed to have found it at the bottom of the bottle just in time. He appointed a temporary marshal, a stoic blacksmith named John, and ordered Hale to be on the first train out of the territory come morning. But Carrie Hart did not stay to watch the politics of the fall. Her war was over, but her battle for life was still happening in the back room of the general store, which served as Dr. Miller's clinic. The room smelled of carbolic acid, rubbing alcohol, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Kalen lay on the narrow cot, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, ragged rhythm. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, missing the bone by a fraction of an inch, but the loss of blood had been severe. Dr. Miller wiped his hands on a rag, looking tired. "He is as tough as old leather, that one," the doctor said, looking at Carrie. "Most men would be in shock. He just ground his teeth and told me to dig the splinters out." Carrie stood by the window, watching the dust motes dance in the fading light. She had washed the grime of the trail from her face, but she still wore her duster and her gun belt. She felt naked without them. "Will he use the arm again?" Carrie asked. "With time," the doctor said. "And if he doesn't try to wrestle any steers for a month or two, I gave him laudanum for the pain. He should sleep through the night." The doctor packed his bag and paused at the door. He looked at Carrie, really looked at her for the first time in years without the lens of gossip or fear. "You did a brave thing today, Caroline," he said softly. "Stupid, but brave." "I just wanted it to end, Doctor," she replied. "It has ended," he said. "Get some rest." When he left, Carrie did not rest. She pulled a wooden chair to the side of the cot. Kalen was drifting in the haze of the opiate, his dark eyes half open, unfocused. Carrie reached out, taking a cloth from the basin of cool water. She wiped the sweat from his forehead, her touch feather-light. It was a reversal that felt strange to her hands. For days, he had been the protector, the guide, the strong arm pulling her back from the cliff. Now, he was the one laid low, and she was the one keeping watch. She traced the line of his jaw with the damp cloth. He flinched slightly, a murmur escaping his lips, a word in Navajo she did not understand, but it sounded like a name. "I am here," she whispered. "I am not going anywhere." She stayed there all night. She listened to the town quiet down. She listened to the wind rattle the window pane, and she listened to the steady beat of his heart, the only sound that mattered in the world. 3 days later, the court convened. It was not a grand trial. It was a hearing held in the back of the saloon because the courthouse roof was leaking. Judge Holloway sat behind a poker table, a gavel improvised from a heavy glass tumbler. The room was packed. Every soul in Mesa Ridge wanted to see the final act of the drama. Carrie sat in the front row, her posture rigid. She had expected to feel triumphant, but she only felt tired. The testimony was short. Dr. Miller presented his medical findings on the boy from 3 years ago. The grocer testified to Briggs's threats. But the silence in the room became absolute when the door opened and a young Navajo man walked in. He was perhaps 15 years old now, walking with a slight limp. He wore a clean shirt and traditional moccasins. It was Hastien. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Carrie. His eyes were dark pools of memory. Through a translator, Kalen, who stood by the wall, his arm in a sling. Looking pale but upright, the boy told his story. He spoke of the sheep, the drunk man with the gun, and the woman with hair like fire who had stepped between him and death. "She did not murder," Kalen translated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "She saved. The bullet that killed the white man was an accident of the struggle, but the bullet that hit me was not." Hastien lifted his foot, showing the scarred deformity where the bone had been shattered years ago. The shame in the room was palpable. The men who had ridden in posses to hunt Carrie Hart looked at their boots. The women who had whispered about her morals clutched their shawls tighter. They realized they had been henchmen to a lie. Judge Holloway banged the glass on the table. "In light of the evidence," the judge announced, his voice gravelly, "the warrant for Caroline Hart is hereby quashed. The reward is void. And let the record show that the death of Colton Briggs, Jr. was an act of self-defense." He looked at Carrie. "You are a free woman, Miss Hart. And as for the property seized by Mr. Briggs, your father's ranch, it will be returned to your name, effective immediately." Carrie stood up. She felt the gazes of the town upon her. They were different now. The hatred was gone, replaced by a begrudging, wary respect. She was no longer the whore. She was the woman who had broken Colton Briggs, but she could still feel the distance. To them, she was still dangerous. She was still the woman who rode with Indians. A piece of paper from a judge could clear her name, but it could not scrub the wild from her reputation. She walked out of the saloon, Kaylin falling into step beside her. They walked into the bright sunlight of the street.
"It is done," Kaylin said.
"Is it?" Carrie asked, looking at the people parting to let them pass. "They still look at me like I might bite." "Wolves are respected," Kaylin said. "Dogs are patted on the head. Be the wolf. Caroline." The days following the verdict were a strange limbo. Carrie rode out to her father's ranch. It was a ruin. The house was a charred skeleton of timber. The fences were down. The corrals were overgrown with tumbleweed. She sat on her horse, looking at the ashes of her childhood. She tried to conjure the ghost of her father, the sound of his laugh, but all she could hear was the wind whistling through the broken ribs of the barn. She realized then that she could not rebuild this. Not alone, and not here. The memories were too sharp, the ground too soaked in bad blood. She returned to town to find Kaylin packing his saddlebags outside the livery stable. He was moving slowly, his left arm still bound tight against his chest, but he was preparing to ride. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Carrie's chest. "You are leaving," she said, striding toward him. Kaylin stopped. He turned to face her. The swelling in his face had gone down, revealing the sharp, handsome lines of his features. "My work is done," he said simply. "Briggs is in a cage. You are free. I must go back to the valley. The elders are waiting to see if the army will honor the peace." Carrie stood in front of him, feeling suddenly small. "Just like that you ride off into the sunset." Kaylin stepped closer. The horses shifted around them. "I am a scout, Caroline," he said. "I live between places. I do not belong in this town." "And me?" she asked, the question hanging in the air, vulnerable and raw. "Where do I belong?" Kaylin looked at her. He saw the conflict in her eyes. He saw the woman who had 3 choices before her, and none of them were easy. "You have your land back," he said. "You can build a house. You can find a husband who does not carry a gun for a living. You can be safe." "Safe," Carrie repeated the word with a bitter laugh. "I tried safe once. It almost got me killed. I don't want safe. Kaylin, I don't know what I want." Kaylin reached out with his good hand. He did not touch her, but he held his hand in the space between them, an open invitation. "You are free, Caroline," he said, his voice low and intense. "I told you that night in the cave, I will not take anything you do not give. I will not ask you to come with me. The life of a Navajo wife is hard. It is dust and cold and hunger. It is watching your children grow up in a world that wants to erase them." He looked toward the red mesas in the distance. "I do not own you," he continued. "I never did. If you stay here, you survive. If you ride south, you survive. But whatever you choose, it must be your path, not mine." It was the anti-claim. Every man she had ever known her father. Colton Briggs. Even the men in the saloons had tried to tell her who she was. They had tried to put a fence around her. Kaylin was the only one tearing the fences down. Carrie looked at him. She looked at the man who had bled for her, who had defied his own people for her. and who was now willing to walk away to protect her freedom. And in that moment, the answer became clear. Freedom wasn't about having no ties. That was just loneliness. Freedom was choosing which rope you wanted to hold on to. "I can't go back to the ranch," Carrie said softly. "There are too many ghosts. And I can't live in this town. The walls are too close." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "But I can't be a Navajo, Kaylin," she said honestly. "I am white. I cannot weave blankets and pretend I don't know the world outside. I would be an outsider there, too." Kaylin nodded slowly, a shadow of pain crossing his eyes. "Then we part ways." "No," Carrie said. "We don't." She grabbed the reins of his Appaloosa, stopping him from mounting. "There is a place," she said, her mind racing, the idea forming as she spoke, "by the Iron Creek, where the canyon opens up to the flatlands. It is on the edge. Not quite Navajo land, not quite Mesa Ridge territory." Kaylin frowned. "I know the place. It is rock and scrub." "It is water," Carrie corrected. "And it is a trail. The wagons pass through there. Your people pass through there to hunt." She looked up at him, her eyes burning with a new kind of fire, not the fire of destruction, but of creation. "We build a post," she said, "a way station. We sell beef. We trade horses. We trade wool and silver from your people to the travelers. We make a place where the two worlds meet, but where neither rules." Kaylin stared at her. He processed the idea. A place in the middle. A bridge. "It would be dangerous," he said. "Both sides would look at us with suspicion." "Let them look," Carrie said, a grin tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I have a reputation, and you, well, you are the man who shot a sniper off a roof with his left hand. I think they will be too scared to cheat us." Kaylin looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was a genuine smile, rare and beautiful. "A trading post," he mused. "Run by a wild woman and a broken scout." "Run by partners," Carrie corrected. She reached out and took his hand, the good one. She squeezed it hard. "I am choosing my path, Kaylin, and my path goes to Iron Creek. The question is, are you riding with me?" Kaylin looked at their joined hands. He looked at the woman who had captured his heart by refusing to be captured. "I will need a hammer," he said, "and a lot of wood." Carrie laughed. It was a sound of pure joy, something she hadn't heard from herself in years. The news of their plan traveled fast, carried by the wind and the gossip of the frontier. When Kaylin returned to the valley to speak with the elders, he did not go alone. Carrie rode beside him. This time, she did not ride behind him like a prisoner, but abreast, like an equal. Atsa was waiting by the fire. The old woman listened as Carrie explained the plan in broken Navajo and fluent English. She explained that this station would be a place where the tribe could trade their goods without being cheated by the merchants in town, a place where they could get ammunition and flour without fear of being arrested. The men grumbled. They worried about the white men coming too close to the sanctuary. But Atsa looked at Carrie. She saw the determination in the young woman's jaw. "The world is changing," Atsa said to the council. "The railroad comes, the fences come. If we hide in the rocks, we starve. If we fight, we die. Maybe it is time to stand in the doorway." She looked at Kaylin. "You have found a woman who fights like a badger," Atsa said, a twinkle in her eye. "She will make you tired, but she will make you strong." The approval was not given with fanfare, but with a nod. The tribe would not stop them. In fact, 2 days later, 3 young men arrived at Iron Creek with axes, sent by the elders to help cut the timber for the first corral. The falling action of their lives had begun, not as a descent into quiet, but as the building of a foundation. Carrie stood on the bank of Iron Creek, watching the sun dip low. Kaylin was nearby, marking out the line for the main house. He moved with a stiffness that would linger for months, but he moved with purpose. She watched him. She realized that the wanted posters were gone, the bounty hunters were gone, and the fear was gone. She was still Caroline Hart. She was still the untamable girl in the eyes of many, but she was no longer running. She had planted her feet on a piece of earth that belonged to no one and everyone. "Kalen!" she called out. He looked up, shielding his eyes against the sun. "We need a name," she said, "for the place." Kalen looked around at the red rocks, the silver water, and the vast, open sky. "Two worlds," he suggested. Carrie shook her head. "Too fancy." She looked at the gray horse grazing near the Appaloosa. She looked at the scar on Kalen's shoulder and the gun on her hip. "The broken arrow," she said, "because we broke the war." Kalen smiled. "The broken arrow. It is a good name." He walked over to her, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stood close, his height shielding her from the last rays of the sun. "It will be hard work," he reminded her. "We will have no money for a long time." "I have $500, Carrie said mischievously. Kalen raised an eyebrow. "From where?" "I didn't turn myself in for the reward," she joked, then grew serious. "The judge released my father's bank account. It is enough for nails, and enough for whiskey." "We will need the nails more," Kalen said. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate kiss of the cave, or the tragic kiss of a goodbye. It was a domestic kiss, a kiss of promise, a kiss that said, "I will be here in the morning." Carrie leaned into him, feeling the solid beat of his heart. She had broken through his guard, yes, but more importantly, she had broken out of her own cage. The sun set, painting the sky in colors that promised a clear day tomorrow, and for the first time in her life, Carrie Hart couldn't wait for the sunrise. The seasons turned slowly in the high desert, shifting not with the calendar, but with the wind. 6 months had passed since the trial in Mesa Ridge, and the land had changed as much as the people living on it. The scorching heat of summer had given way to the crisp, golden light of autumn, turning the cottonwood trees along the banks of Iron Creek into torches of yellow flame against the Red Canyon walls. The Broken Arrow trading post sat on a rise of land that had once been nothing but scrub brush and scorpion dens. Now, it was a beacon. It was not a fortress, nor was it a ranch in the traditional sense. It was a cluster of structures built from rough-hewn timber and adobe, blending into the landscape rather than trying to conquer it. There was a main house with a wide porch that offered shade to anyone, regardless of the color of their skin. There were corrals built of sturdy cedar posts, holding horses that were sleek and well-fed. And there was a campground near the water, where the smoke of campfires rose into the blue sky, carrying the scent of roasting coffee and curing meat. It was a place between worlds. On any given day, one might see a wagon train of settlers heading west, their canvas covers bleached by the sun, parked alongside a group of Navajo riders on their wiry ponies. They shared the water. They shared the shade. And under the watchful eyes of the owners, they shared a peace that was as fragile as it was precious. Caroline Hart stood on the porch of the main building, a ledger open in her hands. She looked different than the desperate fugitive who had ridden into the desert half a year ago. Yet the core of her remained unchanged. She still wore her duster, though it was cleaner now, mended with care. Her hair was still loose, falling around her shoulders like a dark river, refusing to be pinned into the tight buns favored by the women in town. And the Colt Peacemaker still hung at her hip, the leather of the holster worn smooth by use. But the desperation in her eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating intelligence. $3 a head is robbery, Mr. Jebb, Carrie said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard to a burly cattle driver who was trying to sell her 6 steers. "Now look here, Miss Hart," the man stammered, twisting his hat in his hands. "These are prime beef. Mesa Ridge pays 4. "Then drive them to Mesa Ridge," Carrie said, not looking up from her ledger. "It is another 2 days' ride. Your cattle will walk off 5 pounds of weight each in this heat, and the water at the joyous spring has dried up. By the time you get there, you will have walking skeletons. I am offering you water, feed, and $3 right now, in gold." The cattleman looked at his tired animals, then at the dusty road ahead. He looked back at the woman who was known from Santa Fe to the border as the Wild Heart Woman. He had heard the stories. He knew she could shoot a coin out of the air. He also knew she was fair, which was more than he could say for the merchants in town. $3, the man grumbled, defeated. "You drive a hard bargain, ma'am." "I drive a fair one," Carrie said, snapping the ledger shut. "Water your stock at the lower creek. Keep your men away from the sheep camp on the North Ridge. If I hear about any trouble, you will deal with my partner. And he is in a bad mood today because he ran out of coffee." The man nodded respectfully and led his team away. Carrie watched him go, a small smile touching her lips. She enjoyed the commerce. She enjoyed the game. It was a different kind of survival, one that required wits rather than bullets. But it gave her a thrill all the same. From the canyon trail to the west, a cloud of dust announced a new arrival. Carrie did not reach for her gun. She knew the rhythm of those hoofbeats. Kalen Yazzie rode into the yard at the head of a small column. He was riding the Appaloosa, looking every inch the bridge between the two cultures he navigated. He wore his scout's trousers and boots, but his shirt was a deep indigo velvet, a traditional Navajo style, and silver conchos gleamed on his belt. His shoulder had healed, though he sometimes rolled it when a storm was coming, a lingering reminder of the bullet that had nearly ended him. Behind him rode 3 Navajo women, their horses laden with bundles of brightly colored wool blankets and woven baskets. They were weavers from the deep valley, women who had once looked at Carrie with suspicion. Now, they waved at her. Kalen dismounted with an easy grace. He walked toward the porch, his eyes scanning the yard, a habit that would never leave him before settling on Carrie. His gaze was not heavy with the burden of the past anymore. It was calm, grounded, and warm. "Coffee?" Carrie asked as he stepped onto the porch. "We have coffee," Kalen asked, raising an eyebrow. "I hid a tin from you," she admitted, "for emergencies, or for bribes." "The weavers have brought the winter patterns," Kalen said, gesturing to the women who were already laying out their wares on the trading tables. "And Atsa sends her regards. She says if you do not visit soon, she will come here and cook for you. And you know her stew tastes like old boots." Carrie laughed. "I will ride out on Sunday. I miss the old badger." Kalen leaned against the porch railing, crossing his arms. He watched the activity in the yard, a family of settlers buying flour from a Navajo elder, a cowboy watering his horse alongside a brave. It was imperfect. There was wariness in their eyes, but there was no violence. "The army patrol came through the valley yesterday," Kalen said quietly, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Carrie stiffened. "Did they stop?" "They watered their horses. The lieutenant asked for papers. I showed him the treaty adjustments. He grumbled, but he rode on. No shots fired, no Hogans burned." "That is a victory," Carrie said, letting out a breath. "It is a day," Kalen corrected, but his eyes were smiling. "We take them one at a time." He was still a scout, but his mission had changed. He no longer guided soldiers to kill his people. He guided his people through the treacherous currents of the white man's laws. He stood in the gap, shielding the land with paper and words and the sheer force of his presence. And when he looked at Carrie, he knew he wasn't standing alone. The peace of the afternoon was interrupted an hour later. The stagecoach from the east had arrived, disgorging a mix of dusty passengers looking for a meal and a drink. Among them was a man who clearly had started drinking 3 towns ago. He was a drifter, wearing a gun belt that hung too low and a hat that had seen better decades. He stumbled up to the water barrel where Carrie was supervising the unhitching of the stage team. "Hey there, little lady," the man slurred, wiping his mouth with a dirty sleeve. "You the one they talk about, the Indian lover?" The yard went quiet. The settlers looked away, not wanting trouble. The Navajo men near the corral stopped working, their hands resting on their hips. Carrie didn't flinch. She turned slowly, holding a heavy leather strap in her hand. "I am the owner of this establishment, mister, and you are drunk. Water is free. Whiskey is for paying customers who know how to behave. You look like you have had enough of the latter." The drunk laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "I got money, and I got a thirst." He stepped closer, invading her space. "And I reckon I want to see what makes a white woman run off with a savage. You must have some special talents." He reached out, his hand clamping onto her wrist. It was a clumsy, aggressive grab, meant to intimidate. From the porch, Kalen pushed himself off the railing. He moved fast, his boots thudding on the wooden steps, but he didn't need to run. Before Kalen had taken 3 steps, Carrie moved. She didn't pull away. She stepped into the man's guard, with a fluid motion that she had practiced 1,000 times. She trapped his hand against her chest with her left hand, while her right hand clamped onto his elbow. She twisted. It was a leveraging technique Kalen had taught her in the canyon. Small force, big pain. The drunk yelped as his arm was wrenched behind his back, forcing him to bend over at the waist. Carrie didn't stop there. She pivoted, driving her hip into him and shoving him face first into the dust near the water trough. He landed hard, spitting mud. Carrie stood over him, not even breathing hard. She adjusted her cuffs. "If you touch me again," she said, her voice cool and conversational, "I will break the arm. Then I will charge you $5 for the doctor to set it. Do we have an understanding?" The man groaned, rolling over and cradling his elbow. He looked up at her with wide, sobered eyes. He nodded frantically. Kalen arrived at her side a second later. He looked at the man in the dirt, then at Carrie. He stopped, his hands relaxing from fists back into open palms. He chuckled, a low, deep sound that rumbled in his chest. "I was coming to help," Kalen said. "I had it," Carrie replied, brushing dust from her sleeve. "I see that," Kalen said. He looked down at the drifter. "My advice, friend, do not make her mad. I am still learning that lesson myself, and I live here." He reached down and offered a hand to the drunk. It was a gesture of dominance, but also of mercy. The man took it, allowing the Navajo warrior to haul him to his feet. "Get some water," Kalen told him. "Then get back on the stage. This is not the place for you." The man shambled off, thoroughly cowed. Kalen turned to Carrie. He took off his hat and swept it in a mock bow. "You have good form, wild horse, but you dropped your left shoulder." "I still put him in the dirt," Carrie retorted, a grin fighting to break through her stern expression. "That you did," Kalen said. His eyes lingered on her, full of a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It was a look of pride. He didn't want a woman he had to save. He wanted a woman who could stand beside him and hold the line. And he had found her. Night fell over the Broken Arrow like a heavy velvet blanket. The guests had retired to the bunkhouse or their tents. The horses were settled in the stalls. The only sound was the chirping of crickets and the distant, lonely howl of a coyote calling to the moon. Carrie and Kalen sat on the steps of the porch, the darkness wrapping around them. A kerosene lamp burned low on the table behind them, casting a warm, golden circle of light, but they sat just outside it, watching the stars. The sky out here was not like the sky in the towns. It was endless, a sea of diamonds scattered across obsidian. The Milky Way was a smear of white paint across the center of the heavens. Carrie leaned back, her shoulder pressing against Kalen's arm. It was a casual intimacy, born of months of proximity. She was tired. Her muscles ached from lifting grain sacks. But it was a good ache. It was the ache of building something. Kalen shifted, his arm coming around her. His hand settled on her waist, his thumb resting against the curve of her hip. He did not grip her. He did not pull her closer than she wanted to be. His hand just rested there, a warm, solid weight that said, "I am here." "The roof of the barn needs tar," Kaylin said softly, breaking the silence. "The winter rains will come soon." "We can buy tar in Santa Fe next month," Carrie replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "And we need more wool. The travelers are buying the blankets faster than the women can weave them." "It is good for the tribe," Kaylin said. "The money buys sheep. It buys tools. Hastian told me yesterday he wants to learn to read. He wants to read the treaties himself so he knows when the agents are lying." "He is a smart boy," Carrie said. "Maybe we can hire a teacher, or I can teach him." "He would like that," Kaylin said. "He thinks you are a spirit." "I am just a woman, Kaylin," she murmured. Kaylin turned his head slightly, his cheek brushing against her hair. "You are the woman who built a house where there was only rock. That is spirit work." Carrie closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of him sage, wood smoke, and the clean smell of the night air. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The wandering being alone?" Kaylin was silent for a long moment. She felt the rise and fall of his chest. "I miss the silence sometimes," he admitted. "But silence is heavy when you carry it alone for too long. I do not miss the emptiness." His hand tightened slightly on her waist, a gentle squeeze. "We are building a good thing here, Caroline," he said. "Not just the post, but this." "We are," she agreed. She looked at their hands, her pale skin against his dark skin, resting together in the moonlight. "We aren't married, Kaylin. The preacher in town says we are living in sin." Kaylin laughed softly. "The preacher reads a book written by men who never saw this land. In the eyes of my people, a man and a woman are bound when they mix their lives like corn and water. We have mixed our blood, our sweat, and our dreams. A piece of paper does not make that stronger." "No," Carrie whispered. "It doesn't." She turned her face up to his. He kissed her, slow and deep. It was a kiss that tasted of the future. There was no urgency in it, no desperation to seize the moment before death arrived. It was a kiss of endurance. She realized then that he had never tried to own her. He had never asked her to change her name or her clothes or her soul. He simply loved the wildness in her, just as she loved the stoic quiet in him. They were two halves of a broken world that fit together to make something whole. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon, they rode out. It was a ritual they kept. Before the work of the day began, before the haggling and the hauling, they took an hour for themselves. Carrie rode the gray gelding. The horse was older now, scars on his legs from the canyon rocks, but he was still powerful. He chomped at the bit, eager to run. Kaylin rode his Appaloosa. They rode out to the flat plains to the east of the trading post. The grass was wet with dew, shimmering like a carpet of silver. "Race you to the ridge," Carrie challenged, a grin splitting her face. "You will lose," Kaylin said simply. "We will see." She kicked the gray into a gallop. The horse surged forward, eating up the ground. Kaylin was right beside her instantly. They didn't ride single file. They didn't ride with one leading and one following. They rode parallel, their knees almost touching, the thunder of 8 hooves beating a rhythm against the earth. The wind whipped Carrie's hair back. She threw her head back and laughed, a sound of pure, unadulterated freedom. The gray horse stretched his neck, running for the sheer joy of running. Beside her, Kaylin leaned low over his horse's neck, his face focused, but his eyes alive with the thrill of the speed. They were two apex predators of the plains, running together not because they were chained, but because they chose to run in the same direction. As they reached the ridge, they pulled the horses up, breath coming in clouds of white vapor in the chill morning air. They looked out over the valley. The sun was just peeking over the mountains, painting the clouds in streaks of violent crimson and soft gold. The light flooded the land, turning the red rocks to fire. Carrie looked at Kaylin. He was looking at the horizon, but his hand reached out and found hers. He squeezed it. She thought about the title the town had given her, the Untamable Girl. She thought about the way Kaylin had stepped into the saloon that first day and said, "She is mine." He had claimed her, but he hadn't claimed her like a prize. He had claimed her like a truth. He had seen the one thing she was trying to hide, that she was terrified of being trapped, and he had offered her the only trap she could bear, a partnership where the door was always open. And because the door was open, she stayed. "I am not going anywhere, Kaylin," she said. The words carried away by the wind, but he heard them. "I know," he said. "The road is long, wild horse, but the company is good." They sat there on their horses, silhouetted against the rising sun. Two warriors who had put down their swords to build a home. The West was still wild, still dangerous, and still cruel. But in this small corner of it, on a ridge overlooking a creek called Iron, love had found a way to survive without a cage. The Navajo warrior had claimed the Untamable Girl, but in the end, she had broken through his guard, and together, they had captured something far greater than a heart. They had captured peace. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Carrie and Kaylin through the dust and redemption of the Wild West. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below telling me your location and what you thought of the ending. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales, and hitting the like button on this video. Your support means the world to me. Also, if you really loved it, please use the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.